Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a fascinating medical mystery where the simple act of just looking at someone can completely alter their biology. We're going to look at some pretty incredible research that proves just how sensitive the human body really is to observation, and how this bizarre quirk of our psychology creates a massive blind spot in modern medicine. So, think about this for a second. Have you ever changed the way you breathe just because someone brought it up? Suddenly you're thinking about every single inhale and exhale, and that natural, automatic rhythm, well, it just feels completely gone. That relatable, kind of awkward feeling of self-consciousness actually sits at the very center of a major clinical dilemma that we're unpacking today. Essentially, we're taking the physics concept of the observer effect, the idea that observing a phenomenon inevitably changes that phenomenon, and we're applying it directly to the hospital ward. We want to know, does human observation actually corrupt medical data? Think about it. When a nurse or doctor stands at the foot of your bed to check your vitals, does the sheer fact that they are watching you change what your body is actually doing? Just so we're all on the exact same page before we get too deep, respiratory rate is simply the number of complete breaths a person takes per minute. It sounds incredibly basic, I know, but its importance literally cannot be overstated. This isn't just trivial data. Respiratory rate is a life or death metric. In the medical world, it's often called the neglected vital sign. A sudden change can actually predict cardiopulmonary arrest and unplanned intensive care admissions. It is absolutely essential for catching the early warning signs of a deteriorating patient. Getting this number right, it saves lives. But here's where we run into a major roadblock. Let's call it the measurement glitch. The problem is that in a normal ward setting, nurses typically measure this vital sign manually. They do it simply by watching a patient's chest rise and fall. And as we're about to see, this introduces a profound level of human interference. For years, standard nursing textbooks have actually warned against letting patients know they're being watched. They advise that ideally, the patient shouldn't be made aware that their breathing is being monitored. But here's the catch. Until a landmark 2018 study, there was hardly any empirical evidence to actually back this up from manual measurements. It was mostly just an intuitive assumption. Enter a brilliantly designed experiment by researchers from the University of Queensland, published in the Journal of Clinical Nursing. They set out to empirically measure this exact glitch, to find out definitively if and by how much human observation changes our breathing rates. The way they set this up is so clever. To completely isolate the awareness variable, they had 82 volunteers perform a silent reading task on a computer. Now, obviously, strapping robotic-looking, anxiety-inducing equipment to the participants would completely ruin the experiment, right? So they used an iPad placed subtly off to the side to secretly record high-definition video of the participants' chest movements. Later on, trained raters would blindly count the breaths directly from this footage. They split the participants into two groups to perfectly contrast this subtle but super powerful variable of observation. In the aware condition, participants were explicitly told their breathing was going to be counted by the experimenter sitting nearby, but in the unaware condition, participants were given zero instructions about breathing, and the experimenter basically just ignored them. The data here reveals something absolutely crucial. The baseline for both groups started out around 16.7 breaths per minute. During the experiment, the unaware group averaged 15.4 breaths. But get this, the participants who merely knew they were being watched dropped their breathing by over 2 full breaths a minute, just from being observed. So right there, that establishes that the observer effect is very real in a clinical setting. But there's another layer to this study that is completely fascinating. Let's call it the irony gap. There is this massive, almost mysterious contradiction between what the participants' bodies were actually doing and what their conscious brains thought was happening. After the test, researchers asked the aware participants how their breathing changed, and this brilliantly illustrates the unreliability of our own self-perception. Nearly 60% of aware participants swore they were breathing faster, but the actual data, it showed this exact group was drastically slowing down, dropping by an average of about 3 breaths per minute. It's wild. The more their breathing actually slowed, the more likely they were to think it had sped up. The researchers suspect this happens because of something we can call the white coat assumption. We're all pretty familiar with the white coat effect, right? Where your blood pressure spikes just because you're nervous at the doctor's office. So people just assume their respiratory vitals are going to spike too. But the reality is, when we become hyper-aware of our breathing, our conscious brains hijack that natural automatic rhythm, and we inherently slow it down. Okay, let's pivot to the second variable they tested. This transitions us away from a psychological quirk of the patient and squarely into a procedural flaw of the clinician. We are talking about time shortcuts. Believe it or not, nursing textbooks give wildly conflicting advice on how long a healthcare worker should actually count those breaths. Some say count for a full 60 seconds. Others suggest taking a shortcut, count for 30 seconds and just multiply by 2. And some even say it's totally fine to count for just 15 seconds and multiply by 4. So the researchers used their hidden video footage to test if these time shortcuts actually warp the data. And they absolutely do. The study proved that taking a 30-second shortcut and multiplying by 2 results in a clinical underestimation of almost 1 full breath per minute. Why does that happen? Well, because when you cut the count short, incomplete respiratory cycles, meaning breaths that were halfway finished when the clock suddenly stopped, they just get chopped off and ignored completely. But it gets worse. If a nurse is rushing and only counts a patient's breathing for 15 seconds before multiplying by 4, the recorded data drops by a massive 2.19 breaths per minute compared to a true 60-second baseline. Those chopped off incomplete breaths get multiplied, turning a tiny little measuring gap into a huge data deficit. So let's see how this builds. We now have 2 separate variables that artificially lower a patient's breathing rate: patient awareness and clinical time shortcuts. What happens when we combine a self-conscious patient with a clinician who is rushing? We get the compounding error. The cumulative effect here is absolutely staggering. An aware patient whose breathing is measured for only 15 seconds results in an underestimation of over 4 breaths per minute. The patient's awareness slows their actual breathing down, and then the nurse's shortcut miscalculates it even further. So why does all of this matter? Well, think back to what respiratory rate is actually used for. Missing 4 breaths a minute on a patient's chart could easily be the difference between catching the early warning signs of cardiac arrest or missing those signs entirely. It's literally the difference between an early intervention and a tragic medical emergency. Which leaves us with a deeply provocative thought to end on today. Think about hospitals all around the world, taking millions of vital signs every single hour. Just how much of our global hospital data is silently corrupted by nothing more than a simple glance and a ticking clock? It really makes you wonder about the fragile line between observing a patient and altering their reality. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I will catch you on the next one.